So in Exodus chapter 19, we find our Hebrews, our escaped slaves, in a very intense situation. They have escaped from slavery. They've gotten out of Egypt. They have crossed the Reed Sea. They have sung the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15. And now in Exodus chapter 19, they reach Mount Sinai. Sometimes in the Bible it's called Mount Horeb as well, the mountain of God. And this scene at the mountain is one of my favorites in the Bible. It's a scene displaying God's power and holiness and mystery and even danger in a way that's so profound. Israel comes up to the mountain and God speaks to Moses, who's the leader. They come up to the mountain and God says to Moses, this is Exodus 19 verse 12, "You shall set limits for the people all around, saying, be careful not to go up to the mountain or to touch the edge of it. Any who touch the mountain shall be put to death." God's like, you touch my mountain, I'll kill you in this moment. I mean, that is stunning, right? This is an example of what we might call, on biblical terms, God's holiness, God's total inapproachability. It's like, wait, I thought God was like my friend and kind of like that old bearded guy, and when I go to heaven, I'll just jump in his lap and he'll cuddle me for 1,000,000 years. And that's an image of God. But this too is an image of God. The God who leads Israel into an experience of disorientation, of fear at the mountain, and says, don't touch my mountain. This is a special moment. And the people, how do the people respond to this? By the way, there's thunder, there's lightning, there's a loud trumpet blast, so loud that people are cowering. And they respond in exactly the right way in this situation. Namely, they are deeply afraid. And God says, that's right. Moses can now approach, but you all stay there. And so Moses approaches the mountain where God is. So from Exodus chapter 19, all the way through the end of the book of Exodus, right? Then all the way through the book of Leviticus, which is the next book. And then all the way in the book of Numbers until Numbers chapter 10, Israel is at this one location, Mount Sinai. So they're kind of like camped out there for a really long time. And then the book after Numbers, a book called Deuteronomy, actually goes back and like repeats a bunch of the things that God said to the people at the mountain through the mouth of Moses to the people directly. So the word Torah, or in English, the word law with a capital L, can describe a couple of things. It can describe those first 5 books of the Bible, the law or the Torah. Torah is the Hebrew word that means law or custom or rule. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Or law can describe actually any individual particular custom or law or rule that you find within there. So beginning at Exodus chapter 20, which is where the 10 Commandments start, the famous 10 Commandments, all the way through Numbers 10, Israel is receiving Torah or the law in a very particular way in the form of God's direct voice to Moses at the mountain, at Mount Sinai. At least for Christian readers, not to mention Jewish readers today, the status of these individual laws raises a lot of really fascinating questions. Like, if you're a Christian reader and you're reading this kind of stuff, it's like, you might ask yourself at some point, like, if I care about the Bible, if I see the Bible as God's word or as God's inspired word, which Christians typically do, how do I deal with this law? Am I supposed to just apply it to my life in some kind of symbolic way? Are these laws just like something for other people that got outmoded at some point? Do some of them apply, but some of them not? So it can be a pretty confusing read for a lot of Christians today, for sure. So the 10 Commandments, I mean, this is maybe the most famous set of individual specific laws in the Bible. This is in Exodus chapter 20. The people come to the mountain, they're experiencing this fear and trembling and all this stuff. And then the Lord God spoke all these words, the 10 Commandments. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make an idol for yourself. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord. Do not use the Lord's name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, that 7th day, which in the traditional Jewish calendar would of course be Saturday, not Sunday. Honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house or anything belonging to your neighbor. These are the 10 commandments, and they've been numbered in different ways in different traditions. But funny enough, little fact, they're actually not called commandments here in Exodus. They're called words, devarim in Hebrew, here at the beginning in Exodus chapter 20, the 10 words or the 10 things that God speaks. And really, this is a fascinating, strange moment because God is actually speaking these words, thundering them down the mountain to all of the Hebrews, to the entire group, all there at the foot of the mountain. How do the people respond when they hear this and the thunder and the lightning and all of that? This is Exodus chapter 20, verse 18. When all the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning and the sounds and all this stuff, they were afraid and trembled and stood at a distance. And they said to Moses, "You speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us or we will die." Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, for God has come only to test you and to put the fear of him upon you." You see that that kind of like odd paradox, that kind of contradiction. Do not be afraid. God is trying to make you afraid, right? Do not be afraid, for God has come to put the fear of him on you so that you do not sin. So we see here different concepts of fear kind of in play at the same time. It's really very complex. Then the people stood at a distance while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. Oh, this is such a stunning image of God, dwelling not in light, not in perfect vision for all, but in darkness, obscured, clouded. The laws in the 10 Commandments are of a very particular type of law. And when we read these laws in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, we're going to have to think of some way to categorize these. There's no way in this lecture I can go over all of the laws and all of the categories and give great examples and nuance, but we can give an overview that can at least help us sort of situate what we're reading. The kinds of laws that we read in the 10 Commandments have this structure like thou shalt or thou shalt not. We might call these like very direct command laws. They have a very universal feel to them. Thou shalt not murder. It's like when you hear that, you get a sense of universality, right? Like probably every culture that's lived has some kind of law that's like, you can't just kill other people. But still, a lot is left to interpretation there. What about war? Does that mean you can't kill anyone in a war? Does it mean you can't kill anyone if you're trying to defend yourself? What if you accidentally kill somebody? Have you broken that commandment? So there's a lot of space here for thinking and for legal structures to come in and interpret true, but that shouldn't obscure the fact that a lot of these laws are very, very big level, very universal. The law to observe the Sabbath, of course, is very specific to Israel. You couldn't expect every culture to have a Sabbath law, or every culture to have a law that's you should only honor the God of Israel, this particular God, and not make idols or images of other gods, or images of really any God. Honoring your father and mother. I mean, what would a culture or society look like that said, you should just totally disrespect your parents in every single way possible? You should never listen to them. Like, what would the opposite be of honor your father and mother, right? So it's like, you can see how just universal and binding and not culture specific something like that really could be. You shall not steal. Imagine a culture that was predicated on stealing. Thou shalt steal anything. Anybody could just take anything. You can take it deceptively. I guess that's what stealing is, right? Taking something deceptively from another person. So these are big. Thou shalt not. No exceptions, right? Some of these laws, though, get a lot more specific, even laws that say thou shalt or thou shalt not. There are more laws like this. For example, I'm just picking one out in Leviticus chapter 19. It's one of my favorite chapters in the Bible, in the law. I mean, here you get laws that even get more specific, even as they have this same kind of structure of thou shalt or you shall not. Like I'll read from Leviticus chapter 19, verses 13 and following. You shall not defraud your neighbor. You shall not steal. Sounds a lot like the 10 Commandments. And you shall not keep for yourself the wages of a laborer until morning. In other words, if someone's working for you, you pay them, right? You shall not revile the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord. There's that word fear again. You can even see in a command like that, something like a very small but crucial base for something like disability rights or advocacy for accessibility for all people. You shall not put a stumbling block before the blind. You shall not put a stumbling block before the deaf. And God puts his identity on the line. I am the Lord. There's that word Lord, which is the actual specific name of God, Yahweh or something like that, okay? So you get laws that are very big like this, just big laws. You shall do this or you shall not do this. Not ever, not ever, not ever, right? Big level laws. We also get laws that are very specific. I mean, I flip back to Exodus chapter, Exodus 21 and 22. You can read a lot of laws like this. A lot of the clauses begin if, ... then, right? So just picking one out almost at random here, Exodus 21, verse 33. If someone leaves a pit open or digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restitution, giving money to its owner, but keeping the dead animal. Now, laws like this, I think it's weird as a contemporary person, especially if you don't live in a place where there are animals or people digging pits and so on, to think of like, how could a law like this even really work in a community? Like, this is so culture specific, two people with animals. Like, how often were people really digging pits and so on? Maybe we wouldn't read these laws quite this way, but we would see that God is in fact setting up for Israel, for this particular culture in their place, a set of laws for a perfect community, for these people, for this time, right? Now, admittedly, and this is a point of interpretation that I think is difficult, it's not always easy to tell what's universal, applicable to everybody for all time, and what is specific, applicable just for the Hebrews on their journey and as they enter their land. At least this much is clear though, and I think any Christian reader of the Bible would have to agree on this. God isn't just about to keep his part of the covenant by bringing Israel into the land and just letting them do whatever they want. They have to be ready to live in the land. They have to be morally and ethically and legally and ritually and in every way fit to live in the land, right? And so the law is going to purify Israel. It's going to show them a standard that's bigger than themselves. It's going to even show them fear at points. It's going to show them consequences. I mean, here's something that I think any Christian can take away from reading Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers. No matter how weird these laws get, no matter how offended you might be by some of the laws, and I acknowledge some of these laws when you read them, especially laws about how to treat slaves, you're like, oh, that's great. Wait, they had slaves? You're like, why couldn't God be, progressive enough to realize here for the Israelites that slavery was wrong, right? It's true. I won't be able to solve all those problems in a lecture like this. But I think people reading this, Christian readers in particular, can look at the law, and in particular Leviticus, just the way that all of the minor issues of one's body and just, how one treats animals and this and that, we can see that God takes sin very seriously in the law, right? God takes sin very seriously. So people aren't just allowed to do what they want, to live how they want. A relationship with the biblical God, and this was as true for ancient Israel as it would be for a contemporary Christian today, is not a life of total freedom. Not freedom in the sense that sometimes we hear the word freedom used, like, I just can do whatever I want. There's a particular kind of freedom that people of faith have in the biblical tradition, which is a freedom to be able to relate to God in the most intimate ways. But it comes always within a framework. For ancient Israel here in the law, this is the framework, the Torah. So we've got very big level laws, thou shalt and thou shalt not, like the 10 Commandments. We have very specific laws, like about oxes and pits and goring and, kids and Sabbaths and all kinds of things like this. We also have laws about rituals, how the community will act in a ritual context, in a context of worship and of observance, in very particular sacred spaces, with priests and other people who will mediate that experience. And it's all really, really formal. And if you read some of this stuff, you'll get a sense of that formality. What a priest must wear, how a priest must cut their hair, right? How people can eat their food, how people have to relate to their bodies, how people have to act and not act sexually. I once heard someone say, any religion that doesn't tell you what to do with your food and your sexuality is not interesting. Which in fact, almost every religion tells you in some way what to do with your food and with your sexuality. It doesn't even have to be about food, like what you eat and what you don't eat, although the book of Leviticus does get into that, right? Clean and unclean foods. But also just like how you share food and how property is to be had together. Of course, Christians have as one of their central rituals this thing called communion, or the Last Supper, right? Where Christians celebrate this feast of Jesus' last time on earth with his disciples, and it's celebrated in church, right? So it's a ritual about food. And sex. I mean, it's just there. It's just on the page. Bodily emissions of all kinds, just all kinds of like weird and gross and creepy stuff, beautiful stuff, wonderful stuff. It's all going to be regulated. Now you could read this and be like, yeah, it doesn't regulate everything. And it's true that a lot would be left up to interpretation about these things. But God is providing Israel with a framework. We're also going to find, for example, on this ritual side, on the side of sacred space and worship, that there's going to be a system of sacrificing animals, that animals will be killed and burned by priests, and that this is something that God wants Israel to do. You can think to yourself, like, why? Like, what is it about an animal sacrifice that God really wants so much from Israel? Is it just that to see something killed and to see the blood and to smell those smells of burning flesh is just a reminder of the seriousness of the relationship? I could totally see that as a symbol. Is it something about blood and what it represents? Just like, at least for us as people in our relationship with God, that we're able to see just like life force and life and death at stake. Maybe that's what it's about. But whatever the case, the Torah never explains, the Torah really doesn't go back and explain why the laws are particularly exactly what they are, at least not in almost every case, right? We could come up with our own reasons after the fact, like, why should we observe the Sabbath? I mean, that's a crucial core biblical law. You could say, well, you could psychologize it and say, well, like we've learned from studies of human beings that we all need to rest and, do things like that. I mean, maybe. I mean, that sounds right. At least the law about the Sabbath, though, in the Ten Commandments does come with an explanation. One explanation in Exodus 20, and then another one in Deuteronomy 5 where that law is repeated. Namely, the idea that God himself rested, which then just raises the question, well, then why did God have to rest? Okay. But another explanation is that Israel had an experience. They were slaves in Egypt. And because they were slaves in Egypt, there needs to be a time now of resting. And so a pattern is set up there about work and about rest. So there's a little bit of an explanation there, but for a lot of the laws, you just don't get an explanation. Where are they going to do all this animal sacrifice and all these special rituals? Well, they're going to do it in a place called the tabernacle. And they're going to set up this tabernacle in the second half of the book of Exodus. But they really begin the instructions in Exodus chapter 26. The tabernacle, in short, is kind of like a big movable tent where the people are they're traveling at this time, and they're going to move this tent with them actually, and they're going to set it up wherever they camp, and God is going to come down physically, like in the form of a cloud and fire, and lead them, and he's going to make an appearance in this tent in a particular holy place where the priests can approach, right? Already here we see a model for something we've been developing in these lectures from the very beginning. We see a model for God dwelling physically with us down here on earth. That's a model of incarnation, right? Of God becoming embodied. And you can really see this in all of the little details of the priests' robes and the animals and the physicality. It's all like very gritty. It's very physical. God is engaging with the physical world, and God is coming down bodily in a sense, visibly and in sound and in sight, in a sensory experience to be with Israel. That is a model for incarnation of Jesus being both God and human, coming to earth, God coming to earth, right here in the Old Testament. So as we read the Old Testament and the law, no matter what we see and what we don't see, no matter how freaked out we get or how bored we get at reading the laws, let us never forget that there are models for Christians to see Jesus and to see God dwelling with people already here in the Old Testament. So how does Israel react to the law? How do the Hebrews, as I guess we're calling them at this point, how do they react to this moment? Moses has been up on the mountain for a long time. He's receiving these laws. He gets the law inscribed on some stone tablets from God. And Moses comes down the mountain and he hears a sound. This is in Exodus 32. God says, you better go down there and see what the people are doing. Moses starts to go down. He finds out that at the bottom of the mountain where the people are, they have broken out into a wild scene. They have created an idol, a physical image of God that they are not to create. I mean, Israel is really kind of strange in a way in the ancient world in that they rejected physical images of the deity. Why? Again, it's not really totally clear why. We could come up with our own reasons. Like, for example, if you have a physical image of something, you can control it. You can move it around. You can even destroy it. But this God is not to be defined in that way. He doesn't want to be defined in that way. But he comes to the bottom of the mountain, and the people have created a calf, like a baby cow, made out of gold. Because they just demanded it. They said to one of their other leaders, Aaron, Moses' brother, they said, show us a God who has led us out of Egypt. We are afraid, show us the God. Instead of having this experience up on the mountain in pure darkness, a very abstract, ethereal experience, the people wanted something more tangible, Well, how can God blame them for wanting something more tangible, though? I mean, wasn't the whole point about the tabernacle and some of the priestly stuff and the ritual that God would become tangible to the people? Yes, that did seem to be the point, but there's a particular way in which God wants to appear, and the people want to create something outside of God's system. So Moses comes down, they have created this golden calf, and they are worshiping it. God is angry. Moses is angry. Moses takes the tablets of the law and throws them on the ground and smashes them. That is what is called literary symbolism, okay? You don't even have to be an English major to get the symbolism there of Moses throwing the tablets down and them breaking on the ground, right? The people have broken the law. This pattern is going to be one that's going to occur over and over and over again as we go throughout the Old Testament, and it's going to lead to very serious consequences for Israel. Not only does God bring them out of slavery, but they also have rules by which they must live. And when they don't, there will be punishments. God takes sin very seriously in the Torah. After this incident, though, God has a special moment with Moses, which is maybe more redemptive. God takes Moses and says, "What am I going to do with these people?" And, Moses says, "Show me your glory. Let me hear your name. Come, show yourself to me." And God does show himself. There's a special moment in Exodus 34. The Lord descends in a cloud and stands there with Moses and proclaims his name, the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, this is Exodus 34:6, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and the 4th generation. And Moses quickly bowed his head toward the earth and worshiped. Right? He worships before the bizarre mystery of God, the God who says he will forgive, but also punish, the God who is slow to anger, but does come to anger, the God who will forgive iniquity and transgression and sin, yet will by no means clear the guilty. Do you get a sense yet that if you're gonna try to learn about this God in the Bible, this biblical God, if you're gonna follow this path, you're gonna have to deal with some mystery. You're gonna have to deal with some paradox. You're gonna have to deal with some contradiction, like however you want to put it, right? Like whatever kind of terminology you want to use. You're really gonna have to navigate between some pretty strange dualities. This God is not just one thing or the other, not easily defined. All right, a couple more things before we close here. 3 more things. I'll make it 3. Can I make it 3 things? Okay, I know I've gone long in these lectures, but I love it, and you just got to deal with it, okay? Number 1, you're going to get tripped up in reading the law. I think as a Christian today in particular, if you can't see some sense in the Christian vision that we work with a concept of what we might call progressive revelation, that God reveals himself through time in increasingly different ways, right? The whole story is not there from the beginning. As Christians, we really are living in a drama. We're living in a story, right? And there are some things that happen in ancient Israel that don't happen then later. I mean, for Christians, of course, we don't just have the Old Testament, as important as the Old Testament, as foundational as the Old Testament is. We also have the New Testament. We also have coming later the figure of Jesus, right? I mean, indeed, this has been one thing Christians have used as an organizing principle for thinking about this really practical ethical question. Which laws are we supposed to, as Christians, follow today? Just all of them, none of them, some of them, whichever ones seem to suit my time and my tastes, One way to sort through that is to think about what does Jesus repeat in the New Testament? What do New Testament authors repeat? What is consistent and clear with the message of Jesus in the New Testament? You might think an approach like that would just sweep away every law and every principle of the Old Testament, but it absolutely does not. When Jesus is asked, what's the greatest commandment? What does he treasure the most? He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. He's synthesizing a couple of different laws and principles, particularly from Leviticus, right? So Jesus, in fact, quotes elements of the law when he's asked what's most important in this life, right? So Christians have to work with a sense that things change. Yes, I know Slavery, for example, seems to be, not just seems to be, is, in fact, not only endorsed, but there's a system of dealing with it in the book of Exodus. It just comes straight out. There's even verses about, beating slaves or killing slaves. And it's clear that in this worldview, the life of a slave is not considered quite on the same level as the life of a non-slave, which is totally offensive, right? And by the time you get to the New Testament, you see Jesus radically turning around a lot of social conventions. There's even a book in the New Testament called Philemon, which is kind of like a letter about a slave that gets released and how that slave is to be received back into Christian community. And Christians really took a journey with this, even beyond the Bible itself, right? And we've received new moral light from the Spirit, and we live by that in a better freedom today, still with a lot of work to do. So God's work is not finished, and Christians really read the Old Testament law through the lens of their own faith, through the lens of Jesus, and with a sense that things really do change over time. Why doesn't God just reveal everything right away? I can only say that I don't know, but Christians deal with a God who deals with us in history. And dealing with us in history means that God deals with us where we are while still challenging us to a new and a better place. So that's thing number one, okay? Thing number two, is the law bad? Well, this is where Christians get into this theology of what we might call law and gospel, right? There's so much that could be said about this, and there's so much I just do not have time to say. So I want to just put it this way as a starting point for thinking, not an ending point, but a starting point. Think of law this way. I want us to try to think of law existentially for a moment on a really big cosmic level. This is kind of a dumb story to share, but I'm just going to go there. I was depressed a couple weeks ago. I was having a bad time. I felt really bad physically. I don't know if you ever feel like this. You're feeling bad physically, you're feeling bad mentally. And I was getting ready for bed and I looked at myself in my bathroom mirror and I actually thought this thought. I looked at myself and I was like, this is as ugly as I have ever looked. Like literally right now, I am at the peak low of my ugliness, like as a human being, like just physically. I just felt like that feeling of just not measuring up, okay? So in that sense. Or in the sense of, say, like mountain climbing, of trying to climb a mountain and being defeated by the mountain. The mountain is too big. I've tried to climb Mount Adams 2 times. I have failed both times for different reasons. One time I was sick, and the other time I got caught in this cloud, right? And I couldn't see 2 feet in front of me, and I was afraid, and I actually got lost a little bit near the peak of the mountain, and I came down, right? It wasn't so much there that I was ugly or that I had some kind of moral failure, right? It was just that I saw myself in that moment as inadequate. I wasn't enough, right? And we have so many experiences like that in life, whether it's with our own physicality or maybe it's like grades in school, or you could even think of it like sports, like if you're on a team like basketball or football. One team wins and the other team loses, right? And when you lose, you see that you did not measure up. You weren't good enough. There's no way around that. You can't go back in the locker room. It's kind of, the coach will always be like, well, we really put our hearts out there today and this was a moral victory. And, it's like, no, there's no moral victory. You lost, right? And at some point as an athlete, you have to come to terms with that. It's not like, well, we really won in our hearts, but, we didn't quite, it's like, no, you lost. That sense of losing, that sense of inadequacy, that sense of just being confronted with something that's so much bigger than you that you can never really be there, right? You could think of that existentially as law. That's what the law is, right? And in fact, if we fast forward to the New Testament, to a book like Galatians, when an author there named Paul is talking about the law in this exact sense, he's like, that's exactly what the law is. But does that mean the law was bad? Should God just never have given us the law? No, Paul says, God had to give us the law. The law was fine. The law showed us some things. He uses this language of a teacher. Like the law was a teacher. The law taught us some things about God. On the cross, where Jesus dies, this is getting further in our story, but I'm going to go there. We see both the law and the gospel, the good news of God's saving power, in play at the same time. The gospel says the law is real, the law was right, but the law is not the end of the story. The law is not God's final word for humanity in the Christian vision. No. The gospel is something else. The gospel invokes concepts like grace that no one could ever earn. And this is something that all Christians have believed always. That we just can't really overcome this sense of law in our lives, this sense of dysfunction, through just trying really hard to be better. I cannot overcome that sense of ugliness that I experienced that day in front of the mirror merely by running a lot and exercising and trying to make my hair better and trying to wear different clothes. Like, it just kind of won't ever really fundamentally work. And in fact, my body will break down and I'll die. That's the law. That's death, right? But there's something else, right? There's something beyond this. There's some calling out of this place and a kind of a righteousness or a purity and a wholeness that God offers that in fact makes law totally powerless to define who we are in the end before God. An idea like that is gospel. But these ideas, even though they are opposed and they're at these two polarities, they also interact with each other. I mean, we still experience the law in one sense in our lives all the time, in a very good sense. It was good that I turned back on that mountain. I might have died up there. Like, I needed to come back to my family, I realized I was inadequate, right? And Christians still operate in their lives with rules, with community norms, right? And my community and my church and all the people that I'm accountable to, they help me, stick to scripture and stick to those norms. So in a sense, you could say that that's kind of like law operating at the same time. And when Jesus dies on the cross, sin is being shown for what it is, something ugly and horrible, and that requires a great sacrifice to make it right. That's the law. But then there's also the resurrection for Christians, right? So death is not the final word. Law is not the final word. There's a little bit of gospel in the law, and there's a little bit of law in the gospel. And so the categories aren't quite as clean as sometimes we might think. So this is a very complicated topic for Christians, one that's worth thinking about as we journey through the Bible together. Okay, one more thing. Oh, I've gone on so long. One more thing. How did ancient Hebrews, how did they experience the law? Did they experience the law as just crushing weight and death? If you were an Israelite living in the time of the Old Testament, was the law just terror upon terror for you and your community? It seems like no. I mean, you can read a psalm like Psalm 119, which is like 200 ways of someone saying, "Oh Lord, I love your law. I delight in your statutes and your commands and your precepts. I just love it." Ancient Israel found life in the law. They found grace and real freedom to be in community with God vertically, but also with each other horizontally. So this is why also I say that this concept of law is not just purely, it's not so simplistic, right? It's a structure by which people live, but maybe it just can't be the end. Even in the Old Testament, even before Jesus comes, Israel is living by grace too. They're living by faith. We've already had the concept of faith introduced with Abraham or Abram in Genesis chapter 12. He believes God. Really, this is actually in Genesis 15. He believes God, and it is credited to him as righteousness. Belief and faith are ruling principles there, right? So this image of ancient Jews who are just like all legalistic and just living by laws and rules and hating it, and God hates them and they hate God, but they just live by these rules, is an image of life and law that is totally foreign to the Old Testament. It's very foreign to the way that Jews experience God in their own writings, and it's foreign to the way that Jews who are not Christians living in the contemporary world have their experience with the Torah. There are ancient Jewish writings in the rabbinic period, in documents like the Mishnah and in other interpretive documents that are important in Judaism, which talk about how they see the Sabbath as a pearl, and they see the law as a source of grace and of freedom and of lightness, not heaviness and doom and death. So I would avoid simplistic ways of thinking about law and gospel as a Christian, and I would lean into more of the mysterious ways in which we experience law and gospel kind of alternating and playing a role in our lives in different ways at different times. It's just that for Christians, ultimately the law is a symbol of a sense of inadequacy and of human striving that can never really get us to where we need to be. That is God's work alone. Oh my gosh, that was so long. That was so long. But I felt like that needed to be said.